Picture this. You are a boy, barely 12 years old, standing at the edge of a grand Greek symposium. The chamber is alive with decadence. Oil lamps flicker against polished marble, casting long shadows that dance across painted walls. The air is thick, heavy with the sweetness of unmixed wine and the sharp tang of burning oil. Laughter swells and collapses like waves crashing against stone, but it never reaches you. In your hands, a bronze jug gleams faintly in the firelight. It is too heavy for your small arms, and yet you steady it with all your strength. You move from couch to couch, pouring wine into shallow cups, careful not to spill, careful not to anger. The men around you, statesmen, philosophers, generals, barely acknowledge your presence. To them, you are invisible, nothing more than part of the spectacle. But when their eyes do find you, it is not with kindness. Their gazes lingering too long. You feel it burning on your skin, colder than the marble beneath your bare feet. You are not seen as a child. You are not seen as human. You are property, beauty to be consumed, a vessel for pleasure, a shadow without escape. Every laugh in the room, every gesture, every casual word exchanged between these men of power carries with it a cruel truth. Their empire was not built solely on philosophy, democracy, or war. It was built on bodies like yours, silent, broken, forgotten. The symposium was more than a gathering for debate or celebration. For the powerful, it was a theatre of control, where wine flowed as freely as desire, and boys like you became ornaments to be passed around, toys dressed in dignity, but stripped of freedom. They called it custom, they called it tradition. But in the corners of those rooms where the torchlight could not fully reach, it was nothing less than exploitation carved into the very heart of civilization. Close your eyes. For a moment, listen to the echo of their voices. To history, these men are remembered as visionaries, architects of thought, fathers of democracy, but behind their marble statues, behind the polished verses of their philosophy, lie screams that were never written down. And tonight, one of those screams could be yours. Because this is not a story about greatness, it is a story about the shadows that greatness tried to bury, about the children who served, suffered, and were erased from memory. It is the dark history behind the marble shine of ancient Greece, a truth few dare to confront. So stay with me. Walk deeper into the smoke-filled halls of the symposium, look past the golden masks of civilization, and listen to the voices that history tried to silence. This is not the Greece you were taught to admire, not the Greece of golden statues that gleam under the Mediterranean sun, not the Greece of noble philosophers reciting wisdom in marble courtyards, not the Greece of epic battles sung by poets for centuries. No, this is the Greece that history hides behind polished pages and classroom myths. A Greece where beauty was currency and innocence was entertainment. Here, boys were not sons, they were concubines, taken from their families, stripped of their futures, reshaped to fit the desires of powerful men. Their youth was not protected, it was consumed, paraded, and justified under the mask of culture. The symposium, that grand social stage of Athens, was never only about wine or philosophy. It was a theatre where exploitation wore the mask of elegance, where laughter and music covered cries that no one wanted to hear, where power disguised itself as love, a twisted affection carved not in tenderness, but in control. They gave it names to make it noble. They called it paiderastia, an education of sorts, a mentorship, they said, between an older man and a young boy. But the truth was far darker. Behind the language of mentorship lay the reality of possession. Behind every word of affection lay a scar, deep and unspoken, carved into children too young to read. And yet the very men who participated in this, the philosophers, the generals, the statesmen, are the ones celebrated as the foundation of Western civilization. Their ideas about democracy, virtue, and honor live on, but the boys they used, the boys who bled in silence, remain forgotten. History remembers marble and victory. It rarely remembers the shadows cast behind them. This is that shadow, the Greece erased by its own brilliance, the Greece of stolen childhoods, silenced screams, and scars that never healed. If these hidden stories of history speak to you, then you are part of something important. I invite you to subscribe, to share your thoughts in the comments, and to tell me where you're listening from, because across centuries and continents, here we are, connected by nothing more than curiosity and the courage to ask, what lies behind the history we were told? It never fails to amaze me. Somewhere in the world you're listening, maybe late at night in your room, maybe while walking through a busy street, maybe with headphones on as you escape into a story the textbooks forgot to tell. And yet, in this moment, we are together, you and I, reaching back through 2,000 years to touch the lives of those who were silenced. That is the power of stories. They bridge the impossible distance between past and present. They remind us that history is not only about empires and kings, it is about people. People who loved, who feared, who suffered, who survived. People who were erased, but who can live again if we choose to remember them. So if these voices matter to you, If you believe that shining light on forgotten shadows is worth our time, then join me, because together we can uncover what history tried so hard to bury. Now, let us step back. Back to the flickering glow of oil lamps and the sharp scent of wine. Back to the symposium, that grand theatre of Greek society. Men recline on couches, debating virtue and beauty, reciting poetry that will echo for centuries. Their words are lofty, their gestures refined. They speak of honor, of wisdom, of truth. But beneath this polished surface lies another truth, a darker one. For as these men boast of reason and restraint, boys like you are taught a very different lesson, that survival means obedience, silence, endurance. This is where philosophy met cruelty. This is where the ideals of an entire civilization were built on the backs of children who had no voice. And tonight it is their voices we will seek to recover. You were not born into this fate, no child ever is. But in the Greece of shadows, destiny was rarely yours to decide. Some boys were taken as spoils of war, dragged from burning villages, their mothers silenced, their fathers cut down. Others were sold by desperate parents who saw no other way to feed the children left behind. And many more were stolen from foreign coasts, seized by raiders who knew that in Athens or Sparta a beautiful boy could be worth more than gold. The first judgment was always beauty. Not strength, not wit, not courage, but the curve of your face, the smoothness of your skin, the light that flickered in your eyes. You were measured not as a child, but as an ornament, a possession, something to be displayed, admired, consumed. And once chosen, the training began. It started with your voice. You were taught how to sing, not as boys sing, wild and free, but soft and lilting, a sound crafted to please the ears of men who reclined on velvet couches. Then came movement, how to walk without rushing, how to bow your head in the right moment, how to move through the room like a shadow, graceful, silent, submissive. You learned the art of pouring wine. At first your hands shook, the jug too heavy for your small frame, but mistakes were punished, sometimes with blows, sometimes with cold humiliation that stung worse than pain. Soon you knew the ritual by heart, how to tilt the jug just so, how to fill a cup without spilling a drop, how to smile faintly as if you existed only to serve. Each lesson stripped away something you once were, a laugh, a dream, a spark of innocence. One by one, they were replaced with rehearsed gestures, borrowed words, and a silence so deep it threatened to swallow you whole. Because you were not being shaped into a man, you were being reshaped into something else entirely. An ornament of desire. The men called it refinement. They said they were teaching you culture, how to appreciate music, poetry, the philosophies of the great thinkers. They clothed cruelty in the language of education. But you knew the truth. This was not about learning, it was about performance. Every step, every word, every note of your voice was rehearsed for their pleasure. And as the seasons turned, you began to forget the boy you once were. His voice grew quieter with each passing day, until only a faint echo remained. In his place stood a figure dressed in fine linen, painted in shadows of innocence, existing only to reflect the desires of others. You were not free. You were never free. You were property. And in the eyes of those who owned you, you were perfect. The symposium became both your cage and your stage. Each night, the ritual repeated itself. Men reclined on carved wooden couches, their bodies draped in fine cloth, their fingers heavy with rings. Bronze lamps flickered against marble walls, filling the air with a haze of oil smoke and the sickly sweet scent of wine. Philosophers argued about justice, warriors boasted of conquests, poets sang of beauty and freedom. And you moved silently among them, pouring their cups, bowing your head, enduring their touch. To them you were part of the performance, an ornament to complete the scene. Just as the lyres provided music and the dancers provided motion, you provided innocence twisted into spectacle. They praised liberty with wine, stained lips while their hands tightened around your wrist. They debated the meaning of virtue while reducing you to silence. The irony was sharp as the edge of a knife. The very men who built the idea of democracy built their nights on possession. The symposium was more than a feast. It was theatre, a place where power displayed itself in every word, every gesture, every indulgence. And in that theatre you learned your role quickly. When to smile faintly at a jest, when to hold still as a hand lingered too long, when to fade into the background so the men could pretend they were noble while you reminded them of their dominance. Some nights you stood near the doorway balancing a heavy jug while listening to their debates. They spoke of freedom as the highest good, of equality as the cornerstone of society. Their words echoed across centuries, inscribed into the memory of civilization. But to you, they rang hollow, because the same men who spoke of justice did not see you as human. To them, you were neither equal nor free. You were a vessel, a body, a shadow without a name. And yet, you noticed everything. You watched how the laughter grew louder as the wine flowed deeper. You saw how the most respected men lowered their voices when the subject turned from politics to pleasure. You felt the shift in the air when the conversations ended and the night grew darker, when music faded into whispers and hands reached for you like they had the right. The symposium demanded that you play along. To resist was unthinkable. A spilled cup could earn a slap. A word spoken out of turn could mean days of punishment. A refusal could mean exile, or worse. So you perfected the art of silence. Your body became obedient, your face unreadable. But inside, the boy you once were screamed into the void, a scream no one would ever hear. There were others like you learned their names. In hushed tones, their eyes meeting yours across the room. Some carried themselves with calculated grace, turning survival into performance, using beauty as a shield. Others looked hollow, already emptied of spirit, moving as if they were carved from stone. Together you shared glances, small nods, fragments of a secret language built from shared suffering. But even those fragile bonds could not erase the truth. Each of you stood alone in your cage. The men called it culture. They said the symposium was the heart of Greek civilization, where ideas were born, where society advanced. And it was true. History remembers these nights as the seedbed of philosophy, the birthplace of democracy, the flowering of art. But history does not remember your trembling hands, your sleepless nights, your silent tears. For you, the symposium was never about ideas. It was about survival. Each night blurred into the next, wine and laughter masking the same rituals of domination. Each night carved deeper scars that no one could see, and each night you were reminded of the cruelest irony of all. The cradle of liberty was also your prison. You were the silent witness to their greatness and the forgotten sacrifice beneath it. But beauty fades, and you always knew the day would come. At first, you tried not to think about it. You told yourself that perhaps you had more time, another season, another year, another night beneath the flickering lamps of the symposium. But deep down, the truth lingered like a shadow. Every smile they praised, every glance they lingered on, every cruel hand that reached for you was measured against the passing of time. Because boys grow, and once you grew, you would no longer be what they desired. You saw it happen to others. One night, a boy stood at the center of their attention, laughter spilling like wine at every gesture he made. And the next, he was gone. No explanation, no farewell. His bed in the servants' quarters sat empty, his name never spoken again. Perhaps he was sold to another household, perhaps Abba, dunned in the streets, perhaps taken by illness. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson. You existed only as long as you could please them. The men never said it aloud, but you could feel their gaze change. At 12, your innocence was novelty. At 14, your body had become familiar. And by 15, you could sense their eyes wandering past you to the younger faces arriving at the door. Their laughter no longer wrapped around you. Their hands no longer reached for you first. And in that silence, sharper than any slap, you felt yourself begin to disappear. That was the true cruelty of the symposium. It was not only what they did to you when they desired you, but what they left behind once they no longer did. You had been shaped, trained, broken into an ornament, so that when the ornament cracked, it was cast aside. They had given you a name when you arrived, a mask to wear while you played your role. But that name was never yours. When they no longer needed you, it would vanish as easily as the smoke rising from an extinguished lamp. The songs they forced you to sing would fade from memory. The careful movements you rehearsed would dissolve into nothing. Even the scars on your heart would be invisible to the world. You would not be remembered as a child stolen from his home. You would not be remembered as a boy who endured, who survived. You would not be remembered at all. You would become a ghost, one of countless shadows swallowed by history. And perhaps that was the final wound. Not the bruises, not the nights stolen, not the years consumed, but the silence that followed. The silence of a life erased. Because in the birthplace of democracy, in the land that carved marble into gods and poets into immortality, boys like you were never meant to leave a trace. You were meant to vanish. Not every boy accepted his fate in silence. Some tried to resist. Resistance rarely looked like rebellion. No chains broken, no doors kicked open, no escape into the night. It was quieter, sharper, more dangerous, a whispered refusal when a hand lingered too long, glance that dared to show contempt instead of obedience, a choice to hold back a smile, to let the mask slip for a moment. But every act of defiance came at a price, a beating delivered in private, a punishment designed to remind you of your place, a reminder that you were owned, not free. The symposium, for all its talk of philosophy and justice, tolerated no challenge to its appetite. Others learned to resist differently, not with open defiance, but with cleverness. They sought out sympathetic patrons, men whose interest was mixed with something resembling kindness. These alliances could mean the difference between constant torment and the occasional mercy of protection. To catch the favor of the right man was to secure scraps of safety, softer words, gentler hands, fewer nights of terror. But even that safety was fragile, dependent on the whims of someone who still saw you as property. And some learned to manipulate desire itself, to play along, to give the men what they wanted before it was demanded, to pretend that obedience was a choice. By anticipating their master's moods, by shaping themselves into whatever fantasy was desired, they bought a little control, or at least the illusion of it. But this too was a double-edged blade. Each performance carved away another piece of the self until it was hard to remember where the act ended and the real boy began. It was never clean. There was no pure defiance, no pure submission. Every choice carried scars. The boy who resisted too boldly might vanish overnight, discarded like a broken vessel. The boy who obeyed too eagerly might lose himself entirely, his soul buried beneath years of silence and forced affection. And most lived somewhere between, bending when they had to, hardening when they could, walking the knife's edge between survival and destruction. What bound them all together was the aftermath. Resistance. Carved scars into the body, a broken rib, a bruised face, a voice that trembled when it tried to sing again. Submission carved scars into the mind, nightmares that lingered long after the symposium lamps had burned out, the endless guilt of wondering if another choice could have spared more pain. And deeper still, on the level no physician could see, resistance and survival scarred the soul. The knowledge that you had been forced to play a role you never chose, that even your acts of cleverness or strength were twisted by the cage you lived in, that survival itself was not freedom, but a compromise you could never wash away. Yet still, boys found ways to endure. They whispered to each other in the shadows, trading fragments of hope, tiny rebellions hidden in songs and stories. Some carried memories of their real homes like secret treasures, repeating the names of mothers and sisters beneath their breath so they would not forget who they were before. Others hardened themselves, promising silently that if they lived long enough to escape, they would never allow another chain around their neck again. Resistance and survival were not victories, they were not clean, but they were proof that even in the darkest halls of the symposium, where innocence was stolen and bodies were consumed, the human spirit refused to vanish entirely. Because even when boys were treated as shadows, some found ways to remind themselves, and each other, that they were still human. And surrounding you was hypocrisy. These were the men who gave the world philosophy, democracy, and art. They carved ideals of beauty into marble that still gleams today, cold and eternal. They composed poems about justice, about harmony, about the balance of reason over desire. Their names would echo through centuries: Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, men hailed as fathers of thought, guardians of wisdom. And yet, with the same hands that penned verses on virtue, they reached for you in the shadows. Publicly, they praised freedom as the highest good. Privately, they destroyed it, one child at a time. The contradiction was staggering. Here, in the birthplace of democracy, only a fraction of humanity was considered worthy of liberty. Citizens debated laws in the assembly. Philosophers spoke of the ideal man. Sculptors immortalized human perfection in stone. But you were not counted. You were invisible, excluded, erased before you could even begin to exist. To the outside world, the symposium was the height of culture, a gathering place for noble minds, a crucible for ideas that would shape civilizations. To those who sat on the couches, it was proof of refinement, of superiority, of being part of a society destined for greatness. But to you, it was a prison dressed in poetry. The same voices that declared justice is the soul of the city silenced your own cries for justice. The same men who declared the unexamined life is not worth living never examined the cruelty of what they demanded from you. They built entire philosophies around truth, yet lived lives soaked in lies, and history chose to believe them. For centuries, textbooks would honor their words while ignoring their actions. Statues would stand tall, gleaming with reverence, while the shadows where you lived were left unmarked. The marble remained, but the blood that stained the floor beneath it was washed away. This was the true face of Greece, a world that celebrated beauty while consuming it, a culture that sang of freedom while practicing enslavement, a philosophy that exalted virtue while hiding its own corruption. And you were caught in the middle, trapped between their ideals and their appetites. You poured their wine while they argued about moderation. You endured their touch while they spoke of restraint. You played your part in their theatre while they condemned deceit. Every moment was a lesson in contradiction. Every night a reminder that the Greece celebrated in history was built on foundations of silence. Even the myths reflected this hypocrisy. Gods who punished mortals for pride, yet stole children for their own desires. Heroes who fought for honor, yet left destruction in their wake. The stories were celebrated as timeless wisdom, but to you they were simply mirrors of the men who reclined before you, powerful, untouchable, and unwilling to see their own cruelty. The world remembers Greece as the cradle of civilization, but for the children trapped in its shadows, it was not a cradle, it was a cage. And no matter how brightly the marble gleamed, you could see the cracks beneath it. cracks filled with whispers, with secrets, with the pain of those who never had the chance to speak. Because the greatest hypocrisy of all was this: they promised eternity through philosophy and art, but ensured your eternity would be silence. When youth left you, so did history. There was no farewell, no ritual to mark your passing from their gaze. You simply faded. One day you were part of the spectacle, the ornament they displayed, the shadow they controlled, and then you were gone. Another boy stood in your place, another pair of trembling hands carried the wine, another face caught the glint of lamplight, and with that exchange you ceased to exist. No records spoke your name, no monuments bore your likeness, no poems were written in your memory. The songs you had been forced to sing dissolved into silence, as if your voice had never belonged to the world at all. History chose to remember the men who reclined on those couches. Their speeches were preserved, copied, taught across centuries. Their victories were carved into stone. Their philosophies became the foundation of nations. But you who served at their side, who bore the weight of their hypocrisy, you were erased. It was not only your body that vanished, but your very existence. You had been trained to please, to exist only for others, and once that purpose was gone, nothing remained. You left no trace in the grand narrative of civilization, no gravestone, no record, not even a way. That was the final cruelty of the symposium, not the nights of pain, not the years of survival, but the silence that followed, the silence that swallowed you whole. Generals would be remembered for their battles, poets for their verses, philosophers for their truths, and the children beside them. They disappeared into shadows as if they had never walked the earth. But the absence itself speaks. The silence itself is a wound carved into history. Every missing name, every unmarked grave, every forgotten voice tells us that something was taken, something was destroyed, something was hidden. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: you are not alone. There were countless others, each erased, each vanished, each turned into nothing more than the space history refused to acknowledge. The world celebrates Greece as eternal, but you, and all those like you, were never meant to be eternal. You were meant to be forgotten. And yet, here we are, remembering you. To cover their actions, they wrapped them in philosophy. They called it paiderastia, the love between a man and a boy. Not exploitation, they insisted, but education, a noble bond between youth and wisdom, beauty and intellect. They dressed their desire in poetry, calling it the path to virtue. The boy was not a victim, they said, but a student, shaped by the affection of his elder. And history for centuries repeated these justifications. Philosophers spoke of it as if it were natural, even necessary. Poets sang of it as if it were the highest form of devotion. Sculptors carved it into marble, the smooth lines of youth immortalized as symbols of purity and inspiration. To question it was to question the very culture that claimed to define civilization. But you knew the truth. Behind the poetry was exploitation. Behind the marble statues was pain. Behind the elegant words of philosophers was the tremble of your hands as you carried their wine, the sting of punishment when you failed to please, the quiet tears shed in the shadows of halls where they praised freedom. They said it was mentorship. But what lesson did you learn except how to endure humiliation? They said it was love. But what kind of love leaves scars that never heal? They said it was noble. But what nobility exists in the silencing of a child's voice? The myths they spun were not meant for you. They were meant for themselves, to protect their own image, to shield themselves from the weight of their actions. By turning exploitation into philosophy, they made cruelty appear as culture. By cloaking desire in lofty words, they gave legitimacy to what should have been condemned. And perhaps that is why history listened, because marble is easier to admire than bloodstains, because poetry survives longer than screams, because it is easier to repeat the myths of greatness than to confront the shadows lurking beneath them. But the cracks were always there. Even in their writings, the unease seeps through, hints that not all were convinced, that some saw the danger, that some knew the balance between education and exploitation had been shattered. Those faint doubts are all that remain of resistance. Everything else was buried beneath the weight of their justifications. And so the world inherited the myth, not the truth. Generations celebrated the idea of noble love, while the lived reality of boys like you was erased. Statues gleamed, poems echoed, philosophies endured, while your story was silenced. That was the greatest lie of all, that pain could be turned into beauty simply by changing its name. You knew differently, you lived the contradiction, and you carried the knowledge that beneath every noble word was a wound they refused to see. Because in the end, their myths were not written for you, they were written to protect them. So the lives of boys like you vanished from the record. Democracy remembered the voices of orators, men who stood in the assembly shaping laws and boasting of freedom. Art remembered the hands of sculptors chiseling stone into gods and heroes. Philosophy remembered the names of thinkers, their words etched into parchment, preserved for eternity. But no one remembered you. not the child who carried the wine, not the boy whose laughter was stolen, not the youth who bore the weight of nights that could never be spoken aloud. Your name was never written, your face was never carved, your voice was never heard. You existed in the margins, and then even those margins were erased. History celebrated brilliance while burying its shadows. It chose to immortalize the beauty that was stolen, not the suffering of those it consumed. And so you were lost, not because you did not matter, but because your truth was inconvenient. Centuries later, scholars still praise Greece as the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of democracy, the land of philosophy and art. They admire the marble, they memorize the speeches, they glorify the myths, but they rarely ask who was silenced so that such glory could exist. And that silence is the deepest wound, because to be forgotten is to die twice, once in the body and once in memory. Your story was not told, your pain was not preserved, and in the grand chronicles of history, you became what they always wanted you to be, invisible. The lamps burn low, the symposium grows quiet, the laughter fades into murmurs, then into silence. Only the smell of wine and smoke remains, clinging to the air like a ghost. A hand reaches for you across the couch. You do not move because you cannot. In that gesture lies the truth of your world. Greece, the land that would one day be remembered for philosophy and democracy, for marble temples and immortal art, built its glory on bodies it refused to see. To them, you were not a child, you were not a person, you were a possession, a concubine, a shadow to be used and then discarded. You were trained to pour the wine with elegance, to smile with grace, to endure without protest, but you were never trained to live freely, never allowed to dream for yourself. History carved statues of heroes, but not of you. It wrote poems of gods, but none for you. It built temples to beauty and justice, while your beauty was consumed and your justice denied. And yet, your story matters, because history is not only about triumphs, it is also about silences, about those who were erased so that others could shine brighter, about the boys who carried burdens they never chose, who lived and died unnamed, whose existence was swallowed by shadows. Your story matters because it unmasks the hypocrisy of a civilization that praised freedom while practicing bondage, that preached reason while excusing exploitation, that sang of love while twisting it into a weapon of power. And your story matters because the struggle you lived, the battle between survival and desire, between power and vulnerability, is not just ancient, it is eternal. Even now, in different forms, in different corners of the world, children are still stolen, still silenced, still consumed by systems that value power over humanity. The faces have changed, the languages have changed, the rituals have changed, but the silence, the erasure, the exploitation remain. To remember you is not simply to honor the past, it is to confront the present, to refuse the comfort of forgetting, to say you existed, you suffered, and you deserve to be seen. The lamps of the symposium have long since gone dark. The marble walls have crumbled, the voices of philosophers still echo in books and lectures, but your voice was never written down. And yet, here you are, resurrected not in stone but in memory. You remind us that civilizations are not only measured by their monuments and victories, but also by the shadows they create, and that to truly understand history we must be willing to look into those shadows, to name the lives erased, to carry forward the voices that could not carry themselves. So tonight, as we close this story, know this: you were not a hero carved in stone, but you were human, and that is enough. Your story does not end in silence, not anymore, because remembering you, and all the forgotten children like you, is the first step in breaking the silence. And once silence is broken, history can no longer ignore you. You lived, you mattered, and now you are remembered.